She was 16 years old, and she had nowhere left to sleep that wasn't borrowed. Her aunt, Cora Lindqvist, the only kin she had left after the fever took her parents, had married a hard-faced widower named Elias Brandt, who wanted no part of feeding another mouth. And so, on a gray morning, in October of 1887, in the salt-bitten town of Harrow's Point on the Maine coast, he put her trunk on the porch and told her the house was full. What she had in the world was $9.40 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin of her mother's sewing needles, and a stubbornness that no one had ever managed to starve out of her. Down by the harbor, where the gulls screamed over the fish stalls, she heard that the old gantry light, the abandoned lighthouse on the point that had been dark for 6 years since its keeper vanished without a word, was being sold off by the township for back taxes, lock and tower and all, for $9. Everyone said only a fool would buy a haunted crumbling light with no oil, no glass, and no future. She paid the $9 anyway, and that night, alone in the cold tower with the wind howling through broken panes, she found something sealed behind the keeper's old hearthstone that would not only change the entire shape of her life, but would, in time, restore a town that did not yet know how much it had lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, the way that Lighthouse was forgotten, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear where you are tonight. Iris Calloway had been born in 1871 in a fishing cottage 2 streets back from the Harrow's Point wharf. The only child of Thomas Calloway, a net mender and sometime boat builder, and his wife Margaret, who took in mending and kept a garden so productive that neighbors joked she could grow potatoes out of stone. The Calloways were not wealthy, not by any measure the town would have used, but they were known, and being known was its own kind of currency in a place like Harrow's Point, where everyone's boat had been built or patched by somebody's father, and everyone's nets had been mended by somebody's mother. Thomas taught Iris to work with her hands before she could properly spell her own name, showing her how to whittle a peg, how to splice a line, how to read the grain of a plank of wood the way other children read picture books. Margaret taught her something quieter but no less useful, how to look at a thing other people called ruined and see what could still be saved from it. A torn coat was not trash to Margaret Calloway. It was a coat that hadn't been looked at properly yet. A bruised apple was not a waste. It was sauce that hadn't been made. This was not poverty dressed up as virtue, though it could look that way to an outsider. It was a philosophy, hard won and deeply held, that nothing in this world was finished being useful just because it looked finished. The family was particularly devoted to the gantry light itself, which stood on the rocky point a mile north of the harbor and had, for as long as anyone could remember, been kept by a solitary, gruff old man named Silas Gantry, after whom the light was unofficially named, though its proper name on the maritime charts was the Harrow Point Light. Silas had no family of his own, and Thomas Calloway, in the easy way of small fishing towns, had more or less adopted him as an uncle, rowing out supplies in rough weather, helping him repair the lamp mechanism, sitting with him through long winter nights, swapping stories while the light turned overhead. Iris grew up half in awe of the tower, climbing its spiral stairs as a small girl while her father worked, learning from Silas himself how the great lens worked, how the oil reservoir was filled, how a keeper had to log the weather every single day without fail, because a single missed entry could mean a ship lost on the rocks below. Silas used to tell her, only half joking, that the lighthouse remembered everything that happened to it, that the stones held the cold of every winter and the warmth of every summer fire, and that a keeper's job was not merely to keep a flame burning, but to keep faith with every sailor who would never know her name but who trusted, all the same, that the light would be there. It was this last lesson, more than any other, that lodged itself permanently in Iris's character. She came to believe, with the unshakable conviction of a child who has watched her parents live it, that quiet, unglamorous faithfulness, showing up, doing the unseen work, tending the thing that needed tending, even when no one was watching or thanking you for it, was the truest form of work a person could have. She did not know, at 8 or 10 or 12 years old, that this belief would one day be tested past anything she could imagine, or that it would eventually become the very thing that saved both her and the town that had cast her aside. The fall, when it came in pieces, the way real ruins so often does, rather than in one dramatic blow. The first piece was the sea itself, which took her father in the autumn of 1881, when Iris was 10. In a sudden squall that capsized 3 boats off the point and brought home 2 bodies and left one, Thomas Calloway's never found at all. Margaret held the household together for nearly 4 more years on mending money and garden produce and sheer will, but a slow wasting illness, what the town doctor vaguely called consumption, though no one was ever quite certain, took her in the spring of 1885, when Iris was 14, leaving the girl alone except for her mother's sister, Cora, who lived 2 towns over in Pembroke and who took the girl in more from a sense of duty than affection. Cora herself was a tired woman who had buried 1 husband already, and who, within a year, had remarried a widower named Elias Brandt, a man who ran a modest dry goods store, and who made it clear from the very first supper that he had married a wife, not inherited a niece. For nearly 2 years, Iris endured a kind of half-life in the Brandt household in Pembroke, doing the heaviest chores, sleeping in an unheated lean-to room off the kitchen, eating last and least, and absorbing almost daily Elias's pointed remarks about idle mouths and the cost of flour. Cora, worn down and frightened of her own husband's temper, rarely intervened, though Iris would later remember and forgive the small kindnesses her aunt managed in secret: an extra biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief, a coat let out at the seams. It was Silas Gantry, in fact, who had been the one bright thread running through those years. He had grown too old and too unsteady to climb the tower stairs reliably by 1885, and the township, in its practical and unsentimental way, had quietly retired him with a small pension and installed a younger keeper, a man named Whitcomb, who lasted barely a year before resigning over the isolation and the pay. After Whitcomb left in 1886, the township, in the midst of a budget dispute with the state Lighthouse board over funding for an automated lamp system that was being rolled out at other stations, simply let the light go dark rather than pay for another keeper, reasoning, callously but not irrationally from a ledger's point of view, that ships could use the Pembroke light 8 miles south instead. Silas himself died quietly that same winter, alone in a rented room, and Iris, prevented by Elias from even attending the small funeral because he would not pay for the wagon trip, grieved him from a distance with a fierceness that surprised her. It was this same Elias Brandt who, in October of 1887, finally lost patience entirely. A bad season at the store, combined with his irritation at an extra mouth he had never wanted, hardened into a decision he announced over a cold supper. Iris was 16 now, old enough by his reckoning to fend for herself, and she would not be staying past the week. Cora wept but did not argue. Iris, for her part, felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but a strange, clarifying calm, the calm of a person finally released from waiting for a blow she had long known was coming. She packed her small trunk, her mother's sewing tin, 2 changes of clothing, a single book of psalms, and the $9.40 in coin that she had secretly saved over 2 years from odd mending jobs taken in town when Elias wasn't watching, and she walked, rather than rode, the 11 miles back to Harrow's Point, the only place on earth that had ever felt like home. She arrived in Harrow's Point on a raw, wind-scored afternoon to find a town much changed from her childhood memory of it, but not unrecognizably so. The wharf still smelled of tar and fish. The same gulls still wheeled and screamed, and a few faces she dimly remembered. A fisherman named Obadiah Pruitt, the baker's widow, Mrs. Tate, still moved about their business. It was Obadiah, in fact, mending nets on the wharf, who told her the news that would shape everything that followed. The township had finally decided to be rid of the old gantry light entirely, since it was costing money to insure and maintain even unmanned, and the tax assessor's office, looking to recoup the years of unpaid maintenance liens that had quietly accumulated against the property, since it had technically been deeded to a defunct Lighthouse trust, rather than the state itself had put it up for a public sale that very Saturday, structured almost as an afterthought. A token gesture before the town simply tore the thing down for scrapstone. Bidding, Obadiah said with a short, dry laugh, was expected to be thin to non-existent. Nobody wanted a crumbling stone tower with a broken lens, no oil house stock, a leaking roof, and, if the old stories were to be believed, an unhappy ghost or two. Iris went to the sale not because she had any plan, but because something in her could not bear to watch the tower where Silas Gantry had taught her everything he knew pass into strangers' hands or into rubble without at least standing witness. The auction was held right on the wharf, a perfunctory affair conducted by a bored deputy assessor, reading from a clipboard to an audience of perhaps a dozen idle onlookers, none of whom raised a hand when the bidding opened at $5. When the deputy, with visible relief, dropped the price to $3 and still got no takers, Iris heard her own voice before she had quite decided to use it, offering $9 even. Her entire savings, for the tower, the keeper's cottage attached to it, and the half-acre of rocky point it stood upon. The deputy, startled, accepted on the spot, more eager to close the file than to question the buyer, and within 20 minutes, Iris Castaway, 16 years old, orphaned, freshly cast out, and now utterly without funds of any kind, found herself the legal owner of the Harrow Point Light. Several of the older fishermen exchanged knowing, pitying looks. One woman murmured that the girl had thrown away good money on a haunted ruin. Obadiah Pruitt, kinder than most, simply walked her up the point himself, carrying her trunk, and told her she could at least sleep one night in the cottage before deciding what fool thing to do next. That first night, alone in the keeper's cottage attached to the base of the tower, with autumn rain beginning to lash the windows, Iris lit a stub of candle from her trunk and went exploring out of nothing more than restlessness and the old, half-forgotten comfort of being somewhere that had once felt safe. She climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room, found the great lens dusty but miraculously uncracked, and then, descending again, paused at the squat stone hearth in the cottage's main room, the very hearth where she remembered Silas brewing tea on cold mornings while she dried her boots. One of the hearthstones, she noticed, sat slightly proud of the others. Its mortar crumbled to powder, and when she pressed on it out of idle curiosity, it shifted, then gave way entirely, swinging inward on a crude iron hinge that had clearly been built into the masonry deliberately, by hands that wanted a hiding place rather than a chimney. Behind it, wrapped in oiled canvas to keep out the damp, she found a strongbox, unlocked, containing a thick ledger bound in cracked leather, several sealed letters yellowed with age, a small leather purse heavier than its size suggested, and a folded, hand-drawn chart of the harbor and point-marked with strange annotations in a careful, old-fashioned hand she recognized instantly as Silas Gantry's own. The deepening of the mystery began the very next morning when Iris, by candlelight, and then by gray dawn through the cottage window, sat down to actually read what she had found. The leather purse held gold and silver coins amounting to nearly $200, a fortune to a girl who had arrived with 9. But it was the ledger that truly arrested her. It was not, as she first assumed, simply a logbook of weather and tides. It was Silas Gantry's own private accounting, kept in secret across more than 30 years, of what he called the Point's true debt. Reading deeper, cross-referencing the dates against the letters, Iris began to piece together a story that the town of Harrow's Point itself had either forgotten or, more likely, quietly chosen never to remember. In the 1850s, decades before Iris's own birth, a coastal trading company called the Marrow and Sons Concern, which had financed much of the original harbor development, fishing fleet, and even the construction of the lighthouse itself, had collapsed amid accusations of fraud against its founder, Josiah Marrow, who fled the state owing enormous sums to nearly every family in town, including a substantial debt to the township's own harbor improvement fund. Silas Gantry, it emerged from the letters, had not always been merely a lighthouse keeper. As a younger man, he had served as a junior clerk and bookkeeper for Marrow and Sons before its collapse, and in the chaos of the company's failure, he had managed to recover and hide away a strongbox of company assets, gold coin, a handful of valuable shares in a still operating shipping line that Marrow had quietly held under another name, and the company's true final ledger, which proved that Josiah Marrow had not, in fact, lost the harbor fund's money to bad investments as he had always publicly claimed, but had deliberately diverted it into his own accounts before fleeing. Silas, the letters revealed in his own careful guilt-laden hand, had intended at first simply to use the recovered funds to quietly repay the harbor fund himself over time, anonymously, as penance for his own small complicity in having kept Marrow's books without asking enough questions. But fear, and then the long, slow drift of years, and finally a stubborn old man's pride at having become the town's trusted, beloved keeper rather than risk being remembered as a clerk who had once worked for a swindler, had kept him from ever doing it. The letters, several addressed simply to whoever finds this, read almost like a confession, growing more urgent and more remorseful in their later dates, as though Silas had known his own time was running short and had hoped, without ever quite managing to arrange it properly, that someone honest would eventually find what he had hidden and finish what he had never dared to do himself. The final letter, dated only months before his death, named no successor and did not instruct a single line that struck Iris with the force of a physical blow. Whoever you are, you will know better than I did what is owed, and to whom. I trust the light to choose its next keeper. Iris spent days afterward verifying what she could, walking quietly to the town hall in nearby Pembroke under a borrowed name to examine old public notices about the Marrow & Sons collapse, confirming dates and names against Silas's ledger, and slowly coming to understand the staggering scope of what she now held. Not merely old gold coin, though that alone would have changed her own circumstances entirely, but documented proof, in the company's own true accounts, that the Harbor Improvement Fund, money that had been meant for seawalls, for dredging the silting channel, for the very breakwater whose absence had contributed, indirectly but undeniably, to the storm conditions that had taken her own father's life in 1881, had been stolen outright rather than merely lost. The shipping line shares Silas had hidden, she learned through careful inquiry, had in fact appreciated considerably over 30 years, and were now worth a genuinely significant sum, more than enough, if properly directed, to fund the very harbor improvements the town had gone without for a generation. Conflict arrived swiftly once word began, inevitably, to spread that the strange orphan girl who had bought the old lighthouse for $9 seemed to be spending money and asking pointed questions around town. The current head of the township council, a self-important and tightly controlling man named Garrett Voss, who had inherited both his council seat and a considerable amount of land from his father, a man who had himself sat on the original Harbor Fund's oversight board back in the 1850s, and had, Iris's research strongly suggested, been at minimum negligently complicit in covering up Marrow's fraud to protect his own reputation, and that of his fellow officials, took a sudden and disproportionate interest in the lighthouse sale's legality. Voss began quietly suggesting around town that the sale had been improperly conducted, that a minor could not legally hold such a deed, that the property and any assets found upon it rightfully reverted to the township, and he moved to have the sale voided through a special council session he scheduled with deliberate haste, clearly hoping to resolve the matter before Iris could organize any defense, or worse from his perspective, before too many people learned precisely what she had found in that hearth. Iris, however, had inherited more from her parents and from Silas than coin and lenscraft. She had inherited the stubborn, unglamorous competence of people who did not back down simply because a louder voice told them to. She enlisted Obadiah Pruitt and several other old fishing families, all of whom had lost money in the original Marrow collapse, and many of whom, it turned out, still nursed a quiet, decades-old grievance against the Harbor Fund's mysterious losses, and she presented the ledger and letters not as a personal claim to fortune, but as a long-overdue public reckoning. At the council session, packed far beyond its usual sparse attendance once word spread of what was to be discussed, Iris stood before Garrett Voss and the assembled town, a 16-year-old girl in a mended coat, and read aloud, in a steady voice that did not waver despite her age, the relevant passages of Silas Gantry's ledger and the final confessional letter, laying out in plain, unembellished terms exactly how the Harbor Fund had been stolen, how Silas had spent his life trying and failing to find the courage to make it right, and how Garrett Voss's own father had sat on the very board that buried the scandal rather than pursue Josiah Marrow or warn the depositors. Voss, cornered in front of the very neighbors whose trust his family's position depended upon, sputtered objections about the legality of the sale that grew weaker with every passing minute as the assembled fishermen and shopkeepers Hearing for the first time the true story of money they had assumed simply lost to bad luck turned a cold and unified attention upon him rather than upon the girl he had hoped to discredit. The climax and the restoration that followed unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but across the steady, deliberate weeks that came after that council meeting, which suited Iris's own temperament far better than any sudden triumph would have. Rather than claim the recovered shipping line wealth for herself, though she was legally and morally entitled to a considerable portion of it as the one who had recovered and exposed it, Iris proposed before the same council, now considerably humbled, that the funds be placed into a restored harbor improvement trust administered jointly by a committee of the old fishing families rather than by the council alone, to finally build the breakwater and dredge the channel that should have been built 30 years before. She asked only that the lighthouse itself, the tower, and its half-acre of rocky point remain hers outright and undisputed, and that the township formally relight the Harrow Point light and appoint her, despite her age, as its official keeper, a request the council, eager now to be seen doing right by the very girl they had tried to dispossess, approved without dissent. Garrett Voss did not face criminal charges, for the original fraud predated him, and the statute of years made his father's complicity difficult to prosecute directly, but he lost his council seat in the next election by an overwhelming margin once the full story became common knowledge in Harrow's Point, and he and his family quietly relocated away from a town that no longer trusted his name, which proved in its own quiet way the kind of justice that mattered more than any court judgment could have. The breakwater construction began the following spring, funded by the recovered shares, built in part by the very fishermen whose families had been owed the money for a generation, and the channel dredging that followed it meant that never again would a sudden autumn squall trap boats against a silted, narrow passage the way it had trapped Thomas Calloway's boat 6 years before. It is worth pausing here, before the story closes, to return to where it began, to a 16-year-old girl with $9.40, cast out by an uncle who saw her only as an unwanted expense, standing in the cold and buying, against every sensible voice in the crowd around her, a dark and crumbling tower that everyone else had already written off as worthless. What Iris Calloway found behind that Hearthstone was not, in the end, simply old gold, though the gold mattered and changed her circumstances utterly. What she found was an old man's unfinished penance, a town's buried wound, and a chance, however unlikely its arrival, to finish a piece of justice that had sat waiting in the dark for 30 years, for someone patient enough and honest enough to notice it. Silas Gantry had written that he trusted the light to choose its next keeper, and in a way that felt almost too neat to be merely coincidence. The light had chosen a girl raised from infancy on its very steps, taught by its very keeper, who understood instinctively, in a way Garrett Voss and his father never had, that some debts are not erased simply because enough time has passed to make everyone comfortable forgetting them. Iris Calloway kept the Harrow Point light burning faithfully for the rest of her working life, the youngest official keeper the state had ever commissioned, and under her care the tower that the town's once been ready to tear down for scrapstone became instead something the whole point took quiet pride in, its beam visible for miles, a small steady assurance to every fishing boat that came home past dark that someone, again, was watching for them. The cottage where she had once arrived with a single trunk and $9, eventually filled with the warmth of a life fully and deliberately lived. And the Hearthstone itself, repaired and sealed once more, became something of a quiet local legend, a reminder, repeated to children for years afterward, that the things a town discards as worthless are sometimes the very things holding its oldest, most necessary truths. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Iris tonight. If her story moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need a reminder that worth is not always obvious at first glance, and we would love it if you left us a comment. We will leave you with one question to carry with you. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Until next time, stay close.